Right, so right now we're watching uh, profile design for environment modeling. As you can see, I'm going through and I'm setting up my brush with purely a black and white palette. I've used the symmetry tool in the center of my canvas. And I'm going through and I'm just trying to knock out a concept using really fast brush strokes, nothing too crazy, to find an interesting shape. Now, in the beginning, because we tend to live in a 3D world, or at least the vast majority of us live in a world that's in 3D, we're used to seeing things in perspective, not orthographic views. So it's easier for me to envision an object with perspective. So this concept obviously has perspective. I'm using just a large round brush, nothing fancy at all. And I'm going through and I'm just trying to carve out interesting shapes. I'm blocking in minor details, but you notice I still haven't changed the overall size of my brush. Here, I'm trying to mimic some of the design language on the top and the bottom. So I have these little spiky bits at the top, and I want to try to mimic something along those lines at the bottom. And again, the point of this exercise is not to get a perfect concept right out of the gate. The purpose of this particular exercise is to get an interesting shape. That's it. That's why I'm not concentrating on tiny little details. I'm moving quickly. I'm using symmetry because this is a symmetrical item. I'm not worrying too much about perfection. I'm just trying to get some design language out there. Notice that I'm trying to mimic different aspects. If I find one bit of design that I like towards the top, maybe I'm liking the way those little circles are intersecting those connecting pieces of metal in the center of the lamp, then I dotted those throughout the lamp. I added my chain in. Now I've pretty much decided that this is basically what I've got. That I like this shape that's close enough to the major form. And I start setting up my model, start setting up my layers to where I move the rough concept over to its own layer, create a new layer, layer 2, and now I'm going to start slowly blocking in the front design. All right. So what I'm going to do is, again, come in, turn on my symmetry tool, and I'm going to start slowly but surely creating a finer drawing of what the basics of this shape would look like from a front perspective if we were in an orthographic view. So orthographic view meaning we don't have any perspective at all, right? So this bit takes a little while, but I'm trying to pay pretty close attention to the general shapes of my perspective concept, all right? I'm trying to figure out what would these things look like in an orthographic view. Now, if you're paying close attention, you'll notice that I actually start off not thinking about the perspective aspect of that roof. So I actually drew the roof wrong. I added in perspective. That's why the shingle bits have an arc down. So I'll end up correcting that later, and you can see that I actually corrected the bottom there, but in my haste, not thinking about the fact that I've messed up that upper bit. Right now I'm just trying to slowly piece this thing together. I find that when you're doing this kind of work, it's better to have stages of drawing and cleanup, and then more drawing and more cleanup as you go. It keeps the brain moving. You're not as prone to getting stuck on little details. Now, as I go through, you'll also notice that I start to make small changes from what the original concept was, right? So right here, I'm coming down and I'm slowly knocking out these little bits on the side. And I realize they're too long in comparison to what the concept would have been. So I redraw them. To get those straight lines, or straightish lines, I'm just holding down Shift while I use my pen tool or brush tool to draw straight across. And I'm still only using white and black, positive and negative shapes. Here, because I don't want to have to redraw that exact same shape, I just make a copy, flip it, and move it down below. Now that's going to make a brand new layer, which you see on the right in the layers, layer 1. And then I come in and I begin erasing out some of the little areas that were fudged up. Now I will say that when you do your copy paste, often your additional layer is going to shift a little bit, and that happened here, which is going to force me to actually come back later and redraw some things. Had I caught it at the time, I would have just used my arrow keys to bump that layer over just a touch. All right. Now here I'm going to come in and start drawing these internal, the thickness of these little bits, the chunks that are holding this area up. I'm still trying to refine small details that have a structural sense to them. I'm trying to also maintain some level of internal and external structure, or internal and exterior structure, not external. That's a new word for you. You can add that to your vocabulary if you like. That's the beautiful thing about being a professor, is you get to just make up vocab as you go. Now here, I'm actually still haven't caught that I messed these things up. I'll figure that out here in a second. When you're trying to move pretty quick, or you are moving pretty quickly, it's pretty easy for the brain to lose sight of certain details like that. That's why it's important, I find, to move throughout your design, knocking out the entire thing as you go. Here I'm scaling this thing down a little bit more because I was realizing I was drawing this way too wide compared to my concept. So I use my free transform tool, which is Control or Command T, depending on whether you're on a Mac or on a PC. And then I right-clicked inside of that free transform to flip it vertically, and then move my bits down a little bit. Now you'll notice it shifted itself again, and again, I didn't really pay much attention to it. I can tell that it shifted because you'll notice that my guide, my symmetry tool, isn't quite centered any longer. Some of that has to do from me scaling it, and some of that has to do from the flip. All right, so here I am slowly going through, trying to clean a few bits up here and there, and then I realized I don't think I like the overall shape of the bottom. I felt that it was too long, so I squashed that down a little bit, just using my transform tool again. And then if you're in a newer version of Photoshop, you have to hold down Shift in order to scale non-symmetrically, or non-universally. So here I try to start matching up the top with the bottom because I realize it's also way too tall. And I'm going to make sure I scale the bottom out with it. So this is going to give me a little bit more width so that it mimics the original design a touch more. All right. So if you're working quickly, it's pretty easy to come through, start to find these little mistakes, and then quickly make adjustments to fix those little mistakes. If you're really taking your time and working with a small pen or working with a small brush, thinking about tiny details, you might never get to the point where you're seeing the big picture, right? So here, I finally realized, whoops, I've been working off center a little bit because my lines weren't too symmetrical. So even here, I didn't nail it 100%, but it's a whole lot closer than it was. And this is just because I'm moving really fast. These sketches, even when I'm done with this is not going to be the final drawing. Okay, this is not going to be the final profile design. Typically, I do my rough brush work, my rough concepting, and my rough orthographics inside of Photoshop, mainly because I'm a traditional artist by training, and it's a whole lot easier for me to just sketch these things out, get the idea out of my head, get the vast majority of small bits of work out of my head inside of Photoshop. And then once I have something that's at that 90 percentile, then I'll take these drawings and I'll export them out to Illustrator. That way I can get a much more defined vector version of these drawings, right? Now, if you're using guides, and I am using a guide in this particular case, it's important, especially if you're getting a brush near that guide, to make sure that you turn off snap to guides if you don't intend to use snap to guides. All right, you can really bugger things up. Here, I finally realized that, oops, I've been drawing these wrong this entire time. Right, so I start fixing my mistake, and I glide on up to the top and start knocking these guys out as well. If you keep your brush about as large as you possibly can while still within the range of usability, or then it's a whole lot easier to knock these things out with a decent speed. You just don't want to get bogged down with tiny details, right? You just want to think about, all I'm thinking about is, what does this look like if I shine a light behind it? What is the profile? Is it interesting? If it's not, well, then you probably need to go back to the concepting stage, that initial stage, and draw a few more things until something really catches your eye. Here I continue to clean up my form just a little bit. I'm just trying to get my symmetry a little bit back in line, clean up some of the shape language. I like that it had some kind of interesting Gothic look to it. Notice I'm not sticking to one side, I'm going back and forth, finding areas that I like on the left, areas I like on the right, and going about my drawing. I'm using a Cintiq here. You don't have to use a Cintiq, although I will say if you're used to doing pencil drawings or pen and ink drawings, using a Cintiq's a whole lot easier than using a mouse. You could also use an iPad with something like Procreate or any other drawing program that you can find, anything that you find intuitive. You can also just do this with pen and paper, or a big fat marker and some paper, or a whiteboard and a marker. When I do these in class, more often than not, I just use a big fat dry erase marker on a whiteboard, and I'll start slowly but surely putting together all of my forms and then drawing out measurement comparisons and so forth. Then I'll take a picture and then drag that picture up either directly into Illustrator, or I'll do a quick cleanup inside of Photoshop just to make sure things are perfectly symmetrical and so forth before I transfer it over. So here we're going to go ahead and I'm still just cleaning up some lines. Nothing too crazy. Notice this detail right here in the center. This wasn't part of the initial concept, but somewhere along the line I really liked the idea, and I decided to stray from the initial concept and add these little spiky bits to the inside. Also, I thought it would be a nice challenge in order to draw something that's different in the middle than what would end up on the sides. That way, when I do come through and have to do my side perspective, it's going to allow me to really mix things up. Now, how realistic is it if this was made in mass even by master craftsmen, that they would make each side of a lamp completely different? Probably not too realistic, but that's the great thing about being the artist. And the great thing about this being digital art is this is our world. We get to decide what things look like or don't look like. Right? So again, I'm just coming through here. I realize I'd like these little bottom bits to bump up just a touch, play with that profile, make it a little more interesting. Smooth some little bits out, cutting in, drawing out. Again, I find it's nice to switch back and forth between the left side and the right side because the hand tends to make convex curves really well, but concave curves are tough. And if you're working in symmetry, it means that you can flip back and forth. So here, I'm pretty well done with the front perspective, and now I'm just going to flip over, create a new layer, and then I'm going to end up copying layer 2. So I'm holding down Alt, and I left click and drag that layer 2, which was my front. Drag that up, and then hold down Shift after doing Command T. So Command T, hold down Shift, and drag it over to my right. And now I'm just going to come in, obviously get rid of front, and then start looking for details that aren't going to look like they currently do in the front. Some of my work I can keep, right? Because this is a mostly symmetrical item. I can still keep my shingles on top, shingles on bottom, the ornament on the bottom, and the general structure. Now, I am going to have to come through and change up these little side pieces that you see, as well as those top and bottom ornaments. I'm essentially going to have to flip them, because you'll notice on the front, my side ornaments are far taller than my central ornament. So I'm going to end up having to figure out what that central ornament looks like from the side perspectives, and then flip it over to each side. And then I'm going to have to figure out what is the front profile of this central, or on my edge designs, right? So here, in order to save a little bit of time, I come in, I make a copy of one of these, the left side of this perspective drawing of the central bit, all right? That way I don't have to redraw it exactly as it is. I can just make a quick copy. I move it over to where I think it's actually going to align on the side. I use Command D or Control D to deselect that selection. And then I start setting up some guides. Now, if you're not familiar with guides, you can left click inside of the ruler. If your ruler isn't open, you can use Command R or Control R to open that up. You can also go to Windows or View, sorry. You can go to View and find your rulers. So I set up these guides in order to start delineating where important areas on the side are, so I can come in and start to trace over or redraw the sides of the front perspective into the front of the side perspective, if that makes sense. So I'm transferring over information. So here I'm erasing the center bit that was part of the front. And I'm going to come in and start trying to figure out, what does this little rounded nodule look like? So I'm painting in and out, just using black and white. This entire time, I'm keeping my finger on the X key. X switches us back and forth between your foreground and your background color, which I never let up off of black and white here, because I'm just trying to get some basic information recorded. This is a basic drawing. This isn't going to be some hyper-realistic finished drawing where I have to worry about shading. Now, this is essentially a fast blueprint, a hand-drawn blueprint. So I'm using that white, and I'm just kind of pressing down with a standard default round brush just to make those little white dots, and then coming in, finding my form, the basics of it, cleaning it up, retracing these edges of the circle just so I have a good solid read. I realize this bottom bit needs to go, so I start pulling out more guides for important areas so that I can get a good understanding and accurate read on what this could potentially look like from this new angle. So I'll come down through here. I realize with this swoop, it kind of looks like it's a straight object. And I put that ridge top to echo the ridge where it is on the sides. And now I'm trying to figure out what my little side profile would look like from the front of the ornament on the side there. And notice I only erased one. That way I can just look right at that without dragging my canvas over. I'm getting an idea of where are the major landmarks for this, and what could it look like? What would be an interesting profile for this from a front profile, even for just an ornament on this object? So I come in, I decide on a shape, and then I try to clean it up as I go. I look at this beam up top and I realize just having a straight piece coming right down, it wasn't very visually appealing, and it started to lose cohesiveness with the rest of the design. So I decided to add these concave curves into the side of it in order to help it blend in with the rest of the design language. Here I come in and I'm doing the exact same thing as I did on the bottom, trying to get a good read on what this profiled piece on the left side would look like from the front. Remember, this detail is going to end up going away. Now, if I decide to make this thing perfectly symmetrical, I wouldn't need, technically, to have made a side profile drawing. If I made my front ornament the same as my side ornaments, I could have done this once, called it a day, and then maybe had a top profile if something was really different from there. But for the sake of the assignment, I'm coming in here and creating something that's a little more interesting, something that's a little different from each angle. That way you guys get to see a little bit more in depth how you go about this process. And from here, I'm just going to let you watch for a bit as I go through and clean up this model from the side perspective. So here you can see that I've figured out what the bottom profiles of the little accents are going to look like. So I start to highlight the guy on the left, and I think probably better off going ahead and highlighting the guy on the right, since I'm going to put this accent on the top right. So I make a decent selection, pull it up a little bit so I can get some of that bottom read, since I know I adjusted some of that bottom profile as well. I copy and paste that selection into a new layer. Just Command C, Command V, or Control C, Control V, depending on what platform you're on. I use my free transform again, Control T, and then right click inside that box, flip it vertically, and then hold Shift and drag it straight up. So now you can see that I'm coming in, I'm using my eraser to clean up some of the areas to get some of the junk out of there. And then I take my lasso tool, make a little selection, hold down Shift, and start to pull this thing out and drag it up to realign it. And what I'm trying to do is get this thing aligned with where the center used to be. Now you notice I pull down a guide, and I realized, whoops, I was just about to measure off of the wrong guy. So it's good to pay attention here, a key to pay attention. So I scroll back, remember that, oh yeah, I need to go off the front of the front design, or the center of the front design, not these side bits any longer. Square things up, make sure that I have the proper height for that accent. Then I give myself a new center line, or new central guide, and I'm going to flip over to my M marquee selection and delete half of my side profile. This is after I used Command E to merge all the pieces for that side together. So I make a duplicate of that and then flip it horizontal, hold Shift, drag it over. Remember I said that when you make these copies, they tend to bump themselves out a little bit. So then I just use my arrow keys to bump this thing back in to alignment. Scroll out a little bit, make sure I like what I see. Go into view, clear all my guides, merge those two halves back together, and then turn off my symmetry and make sure I label my side. From here, it's just save out your file, drop this thing into Illustrator, and then you can start creating your measurements to make sure that everything is perfectly to scale, which if this thing went into actual production, it's quite helpful to understand how big this is compared to everything else in your world. And I tend to use real world scale, but at a fraction when I'm drawing it in. Obviously, if this lantern were, say, 2 foot tall, you wouldn't want to do an Illustrator file that's 2 foot tall. You would likely go in and decide that maybe 1/4 inch equals an inch. All right. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, and subscribe.